Welcome to ReligionWise. I'm your host, Chip Gruen. Today's episode goes back to a theme that we hit on relatively frequently, and that is education. As an educator myself, working at an institution of higher education, when we think about religion and public life and how we might make for a better conversation about religion in public life, it just seems to me, maybe it's an occupational hazard, that education is key to that goal, key to that endeavor. So today's guest is Dr. Vicki Garlock. She's trained as a cognitive psychologist, but after leaving her psychology position at a university, she started working on the question of religious literacy, in particular religious literacy for young children, elementary aged. And this work is informed by her academic discipline, by the way that we think, the way that we develop as thinkers from young children into adults, what is age appropriate, etc. Her career takes a number of turns that are really interesting, and I'll leave it to her to talk about. But moving from an interfaith model that is religious in its origins to something that is more secular and more suited for consumption within the public sphere, public education. So you can see, if you follow the work of the Institute and you follow the podcast, you can see why that's really interesting to me. The other thing about this conversation that I find really useful is that there are a number of other conversations that spring off of it that we could dedicate whole episodes to. Who owns whose stories? Where does authority for talking about religion lie? Does that authority sit with individuals within those communities alone? Or can you develop expertise on the outside? Again, obviously, my role in higher education as a professor of religious studies, you can see, why I feel like I have a horse in this game. But then also questions about the role of the interfaith discourse, as I like to talk about it, that there is, we'll talk about an interfaith movement. But again, is that the only way or the best way to expose children to the complexity of the human story, the complexity of human worldviews, of belief and practice, understanding their neighbors? One of the things I'm actually writing about right now and thinking a lot about are the values that are inherent in a literacy project versus the values that might be in something that is more particularly geared towards interfaith cooperation. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Vicki Garlock. I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. Vicki Garlock, thanks for coming on ReligionWise.
Thanks for having me.
So before we start thinking about your work in the development of educational materials that teach kids about religious literacy, I'd like to talk to you about how you got to this place. How has your professional training or your experience led you into this work that you're doing now?
Well, I sort of think about this as a combination of various things I've done over the course of my career. So originally I went to graduate school. I have dual specialties in neuroscience. I studied rat brains for 4 years, and then I switched into cognitive development. My dissertation was on 4 to 8-year-olds. So I was a professor in a psychology department at a small liberal arts school outside of Asheville, North Carolina, where I live. And I taught a range of courses, neuroscience courses and developmental courses. And after I had my second child, I decided that working 55 or 60 hours a week was not particularly sustainable. And so I left that position and took a job at a progressive type Christian church. And one of my major responsibilities there was to develop a multi-faith curriculum for kids age 3 through 8th grade. And so I did that for over a decade. And in fact, I lost that job during the pandemic. It was a great job for me. And so during the pandemic, I decided to try to figure out how to write some kids' books and take my cognitive development experience and training and my multi-faith experience and training and put them together because I think I have some techniques for teaching kids about the world's religions that work. So here I am. Now I'm a book author and trying to figure out how to spread the word about how we can teach kids about the world's religions.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit more actually about that cognitive psychology background. And you talk about it on the one hand as a career break, right? Going
Right.
from a professor in that field, to then working within that faith community, and then moving on. And we'll talk about the moving on in a minute, more towards religious literacy. But I want to think about the way. I mean, how would you talk about that cognitive science background as being instrumental in your work now? I mean, that it's not what you studied. Your epistemologies are very different from mine, for example, as a religious studies, somebody trained in religious studies. But obviously, right, thinking about childhood development and age appropriateness and all of that, like this all comes together. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And in some ways, I think you don't always know what's going to be helpful when you're in the moment. I mean, at the time, I was just a graduate student. My dissertation was on early linguistic predictors of later reading achievement. So we were basically, giving kids age 4 to 8 these various listening tasks, memory tasks, vocabulary tasks, and then looking statistically to see how it would predict later reading achievement. So that's okay, great, and dissertation, and published an article and got a job. But then the way my life played out, I really looked at the job at the church as an applied cognitive psychology job, right? I was in a position to be able to really take my knowledge about how 4 to 8 year olds, and also 4 to 12 year olds or whatever, take my cognitive development knowledge and say, how can I use this to teach kids about the world's religions? What can a 4 year old understand? What can an 8 year old understand? What can a 12 year old understand? I also had my own children at the time. So some of it was just about, gosh, why are there no resources out there for me to help my kids learn about the world's religions? So I also had, sort of them as cognitive development subjects, so to speak. And I had my academic training. And it turned out that I felt like I really was capable of trying to put these things together. One of the things that's been unexpectedly interesting as an author of a book is there's now quite a bit of research out there to show that one of the ways that elementary school kids and even younger learn vocabulary words is by reading books, right? Books are a huge source of vocabulary words. And so I go all the way back to my dissertation, and it turns out that one of the ways one of the aspects of teaching kids about the world's religions that it's important is just teaching them the vocabulary words, right? The vocabulary words that are used. And so these picture books are an amazing way to do it. And that's something that sort of came out of my dissertation that I never would have expected all those years ago.
That's really funny. I mean, one of the central parts of my pedagogy, teaching in higher ed, and I never thought about it until I had an outside observer come in and say, it's really interesting and important how much vocabulary serves the purpose of learning, these diverse worldviews within your classes. And after it was pointed out to me, I was like, oh yeah, I guess I am doing that. So it's nice to have confirmation, right? That's a helpful pedagogical, going all the way back to kindergarten or earlier. So I want to come back to other aspects of your biography, particularly vis-a-vis religious tradition in a minute. But before we get too far in, I'd really love for you just to talk a little bit about the organization that you founded, this World Religions for Kids. What does it do? What are the products? How do you interact with, we'll talk about the various publics, right? Whether those be religious or public schools or what have you. But can you just talk about the work of World Religions for Kids?
Sure. So I really consider the overall mission of it is to help people who are interested. And it turns out lots of different types of people are interested, to help people who are interested learn about world religions. I do that actually by gearing my products to kids, but it turns out that adults like to read my books too. I have all these people who say, well, I bought your book. And I was like, okay, that's for like 4 to 12 year olds. And they're like, oh, I know, but I learned so much from it. So I sometimes jokingly tell people that, you couldn't pay me enough to work with grownups. I really love working with kids. I find them to be so easy to work with and really for. So there are several different aspects to what I do. One is I write, published kids' books so people can go on Amazon and order them and use them. Parents can use them, teachers can use them in the classroom. It turns out grandparents are very interested in my work because they're looking at their adult children who are often unaffiliated or the so-called nuns, and they're very concerned that their grandchildren don't know anything about the world's religions. And so grandparents are sort of a sub-market for me. So that's one thing I do. Another thing I do is I do make presentations around the country. I'm currently kind of on the social studies teacher circuit. So I go to different state level social studies conferences and talk to teachers about how to teach about the world's religions in schools. So I have a whole page about presentations that I've done. Um, I also sometimes teachers want to, or parents or grandparents want to talk about world religions, not with one of my books. They just want to get a regular book. And those books tend to be siloed, right? So Jewish traditions, Jewish holy days, Muslim holy days, Islamic holy days, Hindu holy days. And so I also have on my website a list of recommended books. And by recommended, I mean books that are not trying to convert you to that religion. And so that just sort of tell you about the holy day without trying to bring you into that particular flock, so to speak. So that's on my website. And that's probably it. I'm also on TikTok. So I've started making TikTok videos. Those actually are for adults. My handle on TikTok is @LearnReligions, but the hashtag I use is Religion Minute. And the reason is because I think 1 minute is about all that people can take on a couple times a week basis. And I just try to teach people a little tidbit, something interesting about the world's religions. So the TikTok videos that are on my website are just sort of to introduce my website. But I am actually on TikTok and I try to post a couple videos a week.
So I'm really interested in a number of aspects of your work. I mean, one that occurs to me is something that I've been trying to do with local school districts here, in our neighborhood, Muhlenberg's neighborhood in the Lehigh Valley, and that's curate resources. So we're launching a program actually this fall that is a curated list of resources that, as you indicate, are not about the diversity of world religions, but about one at a time. So you have to curate a collection of a dozen or so to try to capture some of that. And it's a real challenge because a lot of them might be geared towards children within the religious community itself, for example, and the quality of them can be spotty, right? Particularly for an outside audience. So I'm really interested in that work as well. But for the work that you do, you describe the World Religions for Kids materials as, okay, you use these 3 words, and I want to lay them all out there now, and then I want to go through them one at a time. Non-devotional, age appropriate, and constitutional. So let's start with non-devotional.
Okay.
And this sort of gets back to your biography a little bit, right? Because you describe yourself, got some of your bio information from LinkedIn. You describe yourself as having years as a multi-faith children's minister. You talked about, in fact, when you first started this, it was called Faith Seeker Kids. And now you've moved to be, you've rebranded as World Religions for Kids. You seek to create non-devotional resources. Can you tell us about that development and how you got to this place?
Yeah, so one of the things when I was Faith Seeker Kids, my original idea actually was that I would market to other progressive Christian churches. And really when I started marketing, at that time it was my interfaith peace curriculum was what I was trying to market. And it was difficult to market in part because it came out in 2018 and 2019. And then when everything shut down for the pandemic, churches weren't open and they didn't have Sunday school. So it was that was one piece of the difficulty. But the other piece of the difficulty I realized was that even in progressive churches, what many ministers were telling me was, listen, we got these kids for 1 hour a week, and not even every week because most people don't go to church every Sunday anymore. So, maybe a couple times a month we have them for 45 minutes. And, we need to teach them about the Bible. We need to teach them about Christianity. And so that was so interesting for me. And then I also met my colleague, Tim Hall of Religion Matters. And he said to me, look, you're not going to be able to do anything in public schools with a company that's called Faith Seeker Kids. Anything with faith in it is going to scare people away. And I also felt like I was doing too much. So I was trying to teach people about the world's religions and also offer that as a way to help children find their own faith path. And it was just too many things to ask people to do. I had been steeped in it for so long, and I was working at a very successful, very progressive type church. And I just realized it was just too much to do in sort of one lifetime. And so I rebranded to World Religions for Kids and really started to focus on the non devotional aspect of it, because all along I was of the opinion that people need to find their own way. They need to find their own way of articulating the divine. They need to find their rituals that work for them. And so that is sort of non devotional. But I became much more explicit about it and took the faith part out of the name of my company, in essentially to broaden my market. Um, and I'm not sure people even really understand what non devotional means. But as you pointed out, these siloed books are often written for, sick people write for sick kids, and they're trying to teach them how to be a good sick. And the same thing in Judaism, the same thing in Islam, all of it. And so there are literally only a handful of kids' books that look at various religious traditions in a single volume, with some sort of step back away from that devotional perspective and look at it kind of a little bit more broadly, a little bit with a single eye on these various traditions. And it's just not easy to find those resources.
Yeah, it's interesting because what I always say about the religious studies discipline, right, in higher education and academia, is that the heart of it is comparative, right? If you go back, you look, the heart of it is thinking about these big categories like ritual and story and myth and narrative, whatever. And it is totally not the impulse, right, to talk to kids in that vein, right? That it does sort of start off not only from a singular religion, but religious identity, right, of the group, which I guess in a lot of ways, for a lot of reasons makes sense, right? If like your minister you talked about, right, we got to teach them about Christianity first, right? It makes sense. Okay, so let's move on to the age appropriate, right? Because this is another one that I've been thinking about, because on the one hand, it seems like there is a developmental stage where like everybody's not like you. At another point, there's a developmental stage where maybe basic religious literacy is important, right? And then, that we can imagine that this is something that would grow. So given the relatively broad age range you deal with, can you talk a little bit about what's age appropriate for when and how you deal with that issue?
Yeah, sure. So I think that I take a lot of my inspiration really from our cultural movement on other difficult topics, right? So, of course, the easy thing to say is, well, we shouldn't talk about religion because religion is complicated, religion is fraught with difficulty. We can blame religion for many wars over the millennia, et cetera, et cetera. But what we learned, I think, from certain things, in particular right now, I think conversations around racism, is we have to look at the price we pay as a culture and as a species in not talking about those things. And I think what we've learned, I also sometimes mention the topic of death, right? So death is complicated. Most people are not sure what actually happens after you die, and yet kids are really curious about that, and they ask questions about it. And I think the same thing is true for religion. So number one, we have to think about where it's gotten us to not talk about religion with kids. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we're not in a good place. And so one of my ideas is we need to start with kids. But also, what we know from cognitive development is that in general, kids prefer things that are concrete, right? So a lot of people say to me, well, you can't talk about religion with kids because religions are abstract and kids can't do abstract thinking. This is kind of an old Piagetian type approach to cognitive development, which says that kids really don't do abstract thinking until the age of 10 or 12. And in general, there are certain aspects of cognitive thinking that is true for. However, kids know what the word beauty means, right? Kids have a concept of the word fairness, right? Those are abstract concepts that so it's not that they can't do anything abstract. So I take sort of a two-pronged approach. One is to focus on the more concrete aspects of religion, right? Things like the holy days, things like what people wear, what people eat. Those are things that kids can, concrete, that kids can sort of touch and see and smell, right? Or taste, right? And so, as it turns out, that is what adults like to learn about religions too. So, I have had people say to me, well, you're just sort of doing holidays, and religions are much more than holidays. I get that, and that's fine. And they can talk about belief systems or whatever they want. But for me, I find focusing on those concrete aspects is really interesting. It's interesting and it's fun and it's valuable for grown-ups too. By the same token, I don't eschew all abstract concepts, right? So the truth of the matter is, religion is largely about articulating something that we can't see, articulating the divine and the divine presence and what that means and how we grab onto that. So I think if we look at things like beauty and fairness, I think there are some aspects of that that kids, even 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds who are thinking about God, asking questions about God, thinking about death, asking questions about death. And so my job, really, one of my jobs is to say, you know, how far can I sort of push that? How much abstract stuff can I bring in? And I think that to introduce some of those issues about God and the divine when kids are 4 or 5 is quite doable. When kids get into middle school, then you can really start to compare and contrast, right? And you can start to think about the positive aspects of religion and the more negative aspects of religion. And certainly curricula and resources available for teachers in middle school and high school do that. But what's happening now is that in middle school and high school, we're spending a lot of time just trying to get the vocabulary, right? Just trying to get them to kids to make sure they know what the sacred space is called, what the sacred texts are called, when the religions were founded. There's no time then in the school to actually really delve into some of the more interesting aspects of religion and how it plays out politically, culturally, ethnically, in terms of identity. So my idea is really, I pretty much run in a very narrow lane of just saying, hey, let's give the kids a little bit of vocabulary, a little bit of understanding. They may be driving by a synagogue or a mosque on their way to school. Just look out the window and you can see that religion is happening in our communities. How can we teach kids about that?
Yeah, and so you've mentioned in thinking about age appropriateness, a lot of that third word that we're going to talk about, which is constitutional, right? So if you're teaching within a faith community, for example, right, within a private organization or what I like to call a quasi-public organization, it's not a big deal, right? But once you sort of step over into things that are associated with government and politics and school boards and, public schools and public policy, right, then we're thinking about separation of church and state. We're thinking about the Constitution. And you and I are really on the same page here about how misunderstood that is. Can you talk about that and how the work you do does not run afoul of sort of our basic civic culture?
So I actually give presentations around the country about this, in particular because I talk to social studies teachers in various states. So one of the things that people fail to understand is where separation of church and state actually came from and what that actually means and how it got started with Thomas Jefferson. And so one of the things that happened is people took the concept of separation of church and state and kind of built a wall there. And so what I hear a lot of people say to me, both teachers and non-teachers, say, well, you can't talk about religion in schools. And I'm like, well, okay, that's not actually true. You can't promote a religion. You can't denigrate a religion, but you can talk about religion, right? So that's the phrase we always use. How do you talk about religion in schools? The other thing that's happened is that we've had a number of Supreme Court cases, in particular since World War II. And these Supreme Court cases and the rulings that come down from them are very complicated. Some of them are corrections to previous rulings. Some of the rulings are really about very intricate and specific aspects of the law. And so they loom large because news outlets report on these Supreme Court cases, right? So there's a football coach in Texas who's saying a prayer after the football game. Is that legal or illegal? And there are so many intricacies in those cases that we don't hear about. So I often tell teachers, and they always bristle at it, do not pay attention to Supreme Court cases. And they really bristle at that. But my alternative that I offer them is there are plenty of resources and guidelines out there about how to teach about religion in public schools and to do it non-devotionally and constitutionally. And those resources come from very reputable sources. And on a lot of times, teachers aren't even aware that these resources are available to them, and they're freely available, right? The Religion Matters site has all the links. So there are resources from the First Amendment Center. So these are people like lawyers who have studied this and figured out how you can teach about religions in public school. They write their guidelines out for teachers. The American Academy of Religion, in conjunction with Harvard Divinity School, right? They have guidelines. And also the National Council for Social Studies has guidelines, right? So a lot of teachers use what's called the C3 framework. They wrote very specifically religion-related guidelines for the C3 framework. So, and what's fascinating about it is there's a fair amount of agreement about how to do this in public schools. So part of another piece of my job is just to let teachers know that this is available for them and that they don't have to worry about the intricacies of Supreme Court decisions. And they, in fact, don't even have to worry about what Thomas Jefferson said in his letter to the Baptists in the late 1700s. They can just look at these modern day documents that have bullet points, dot points about how we teach about religion in schools. And so that's the constitutionality piece of it. The other thing I remind people of is that this idea of having separation of church and state and a publicly funded public school system, these are relatively speaking new ideas in the course of human history. So we haven't got it all figured out. This has been, since the nation was founded, it's been difficult to figure out how to make all this work. Right? Do we fund parochial schools? Do we fund, and it's still happening. There's a court case in Oklahoma right now. So some of it is about kind of recognizing with a certain amount of perspective that it's okay that this is an issue, but also seeing that we do have resources and guidelines and some ways to see our way through it for people on the ground trying to make this work.
Yeah, it's one of the things when I do presentations, professional development for local teachers, I go and, call up state standards. And I think there are a lot of teachers, they're very busy with lots of things. They might not pour through the state standards as closely as they could. And it's like, look, here it is in the Pennsylvania state standards. I think these things are sometimes maybe wiser, right? And maybe, at the policy level than we sometimes give them credit for, because it's the bullet point or the fight at the school board meeting or the misunderstanding of the Supreme Court case that gets the attention.
Well, the state standards, I'm glad you brought that up because it addresses both the constitutionality and the age appropriateness. So I as well have looked at lots of different state standards. Those are also freely available. One of the things that Tim Hall and I hear regularly is, so we talk about why do you not want to teach about religion in schools when you can look out into your classroom? Of course, you can't tell what religion a person is by looking at them, but sometimes you kind of can. And teachers in school districts know their community. They live in their community. They're part of their community. They know when they look out into their classroom and talk to these parents at the parents' nights that everyone is not Christian, right? And yet they don't know what to do about it. And they're nervous and afraid. And one of the things Tim and I routinely say is go back to the standards. And it's not usually pushback from administrators. It's pushback from parents and pushback from sometimes other colleagues, other teachers in your school. And so the state standards are amazing. Again, like you say, very few teachers, especially at the K-5 level, want to sit around and sift through the state standards. But what's fascinating about it is I can look at the kindergarten standards for every state I've looked at so far, and there is something in there. Maybe it doesn't mention religion per se, but there's something in there about recognizing that you're part of a community, recognizing that you and other members of the community are similar in some ways and different in some ways. That is in kindergarten. So, of course, that builds throughout the years. And so it does go to the idea that recognizing that people in the community might be different from you in some ways, similar in some ways, different. That is something that shows up at the very, very beginning that educators have recognized as important. And religion is clearly part of identity. I'm just reading a study about how, we all know people don't go to church all the time anymore, and we hear about churches closing down. In fact, in my hometown, I grew up in the middle of the Midwest in a town that has about 30,000 people in it. There is an Islamic center there now, and they bought a church that shut down, and that's now where they meet, as the Islamic center, right? And so I think that we're starting to realize that we have to be able to incorporate this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. The careful listener will notice that we agree on a lot of things, that we are sort of singing from the same hymn book in a lot of ways. But I want to push a couple things in my research I've done, and I just want to give you the opportunity to talk about them a little bit. Things where I was like, okay, let's think about that one a little more. So, for example, on your website, you say faith traditions are fascinating, ancient, influential, unique, and beautiful. And I say on a good day, yeah, I would agree with most of that. But certainly, right, in the broad diversity of world religions and over time, both abroad, closer to home, religious traditions can be beautiful and they can also be ugly, right? That they can be intolerant, right? That they can be violent. The vast majority of human conflict at one way, shape, or form can be talked about in terms of religion on some level. So let's talk about that. And maybe this gets back to the age appropriateness question. And I think it also has to do with what's included when we're talking about curriculum like this.
Yeah. Well, it was sort of interesting to me that you mentioned the word beautiful because, I'm always, not always, but I spend a lot of time thinking about the concrete aspects of religion, right? So when I say beautiful, I'm thinking about, sacred spaces and altars and icons and the influence of religion on art. And literature and culture in general. And then when you think about beautiful, you sort of thought about it in the most abstract way, right? Like that they are beautiful entities in our world, and we can argue with that. So I thought our take on the word beautiful, in fact, was sort of interesting. Our different takes on the word beautiful. So, yeah, I do think that at some point, and certainly what cognitive theory would suggest is in middle school and high school, that this is the time when we sort of wrestle with those ideas, right? We wrestle with the pros and cons of having a military. We ask students to wrestle with the pros and cons of having a two-party system in this country. And so I think there is certainly a place for that. Religion is, I think I don't know what people are waiting for. I think people are sort of looking at the nuns and the unaffiliated and they're saying, oh my gosh, maybe religion will just go away. And what I'm here to say is that is not going to happen anytime soon. Not in our lifetimes. If there are 8 billion people on the planet, estimates right now are that over 5 billion of them identify with a particular religion. So this is where we're at. And I think then the question becomes, what do we do about that? And again, I think that talking about, I think certainly in middle school, and I think a lot of middle school standards allude to this, looking at religion as it has influenced literature and arts and culture, I think is important. And I think it serves us all well if kids have some idea about what different religions are and what some of the vocabulary is before we get to that point, so that by the time they're in middle school and high school, they can play around with some of these more complicated, more complex issues.
Yeah. So I want to kind of combine that conversation with the next one. which is the idea of inclusion, of what's included, right? Because then it can get a little bit more sticky. We have a public discourse in our culture where we like to talk about world religions, which has been famously, a lot of ink has been spilled on the concept of world religions because of what it leaves out, right? So it's Christianity and Judaism and Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism, right? Like people's numbers go from 6 to 8 on what counts as a world religion. And so it mentions these big, usually numerically significant, that it becomes about sort of Western ideas of how one builds the category of religion, right? It gets really sticky really fast. And, you have made attempts in some of the things that I've read to sort of transcend that to some extent. But you, in previous conversations, you've also told me that you've gotten a little bit of pushback on that as well. So can you talk a little bit about inclusions, about the idea of world religion, and about how this operates for an elementary school audience?
So, okay, there's sort of at least three different tracks we could take with this. So, first, I'll talk about which religions are included and which are not. So, I'm all for, depending on how you count, right? There are tens of thousands of different religions. And I would actually argue, and I have said before, that if there are 8 billion people on the planet, there are 8 billion different faith stories, right? So when you really get right down to it, each person develops sort of their own religious path in many ways. So where does the line get drawn? And so for me, what has kind of evolved is some mix of professional and personal interests. So I do think that 5 or 6 is about as many as teachers can handle, as many as parents can handle. I'm looking for at least some level of familiarity, right? So I often tell teachers that if you can do what I kind of call the big 6, which is not a great term, but the 3 monotheistic religions, right? Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? And the funny thing is, many people don't realize is how small of a religion Judaism is, right? It's tiny. It's so tiny on the world scale, and yet it plays a huge role in our culture, right? Which is, why I include it. And then on the other side, so to speak, as you talk about how we divide up the globe, right? Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. And Sikhism is really fascinating because, again, it's in some ways the opposite of what happens with Judaism. By many counts, Sikhism is the 5th largest religion in the world, and many Americans don't even know what it is, right? They see someone in a turban and they think they're Muslim. So that's kind of, if I'm sort of pushed into giving people guidelines, that's what I often say. And honestly, if you can do just that, right, have some basic understanding of those 6, that will serve you well, right? You can use that knowledge base then to study all sorts of other sects, factions, religions, right? But I live in Asheville, North Carolina, which is a relatively small town. We have a very active Baha'i community. And so I have a lot of connections in the Baha'i community. And I know, because of that, I know something about the Baha'i faith. I have people that I can ask questions. And so I often include the Baha'i faith. And that's just almost sort of a personal thing, right? That just is a sort of a happenstance because of where I live and that we happen to have an active community. The same thing is true for neo-pagan or Wiccan. We have a very active Wiccan community here as well. I'm friends, colleagues with she calls herself our village witch. And so again, I often try to include that just because it's interesting to me and I know a little bit about it. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it, I think, is to what extent do we want to talk about beliefs? So I'm actually not a fan of talking about beliefs because I think that we don't know what people believe. And one of my many goals in life is to get us to stop saying Muslims believe, Buddhists believe, because I don't think we know. And I think for most of us, many of us are most familiar with Christianity. And so I often use that as an example, right? We know by being part of this culture or perhaps being raised in a Christian tradition that not all Christians believe the same thing. We know that not all Catholics believe the same thing, right? Most of us could probably name a Catholic who is not pro-life, right? But we tend to gloss faith traditions that aren't familiar to us, right? That same thing holds for every religious tradition, right? There's a spectrum of beliefs that go from orthodox all the way to progressive and everything in between. So I tend not to focus so much on beliefs for that reason, not to mention the fact that beliefs are highly abstract. And so I do think that that's problematic on two levels in my work with kids. The other aspect is sort of other things like sort of on opposite ends of the spectrum, right? So one of them is new religious movements. So things that came into being, let's say, in the last, we'll call it 150, 200 years, right? Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormonism, right? All of that stuff is really interesting. Part of the reason why I find those more difficult to include in my work is that I'm trying to find concrete things to hang on to, like holy days and sacred spaces and sacred texts, and also stories. I have found that more difficult to do with some of the new religious movements, right? Again, not opposed to it, but I find it to be almost sort of too detailed for people. On the opposite side is indigenous traditions, right? So those are very, very old. In my book, We All Have Sacred Spaces. I started with indigenous traditions because their sacred spaces were in nature. And to a certain extent, all sacred spaces started. That's all we had. That's what we had was nature. And so everything started with that. And I thought that that was a necessary backdrop to then talk about the earliest built spaces, the earliest constructed spaces, which we begin to see in the Hindu traditions, right? And so that made sense. But one of the things that I've run into in terms of pushback is indigenous people who have been very clear with me that these are not my stories to tell. So, one of the things that I find lacking in the new religious movements is these ancient stories, these stories that were originally told orally and eventually written down, right? Those stories like that are not as prevalent in the new religious movements, right? Those stories are very prevalent in indigenous traditions, tons of stories. And yet, it's been clear that those are not my stories to tell. So I end up now focusing in a particular historical range, right? Let's say from 3 or 4,000 BCE to 1850, right? And that's an interesting question. Who owns these stories and who can tell these stories and what responsibility do they have? So I've been told that doing research, talking to indigenous people, and writing my own version of that story is not appropriate. And so I have moved away from that as well.
Yeah, and that is a topic for another day and another episode. But, so what's difficult about that is then the result is that the story ends up not being included and not being told, right? Which is a sort of a poverty for the students reading your books, right?
Yeah, I think a poverty for the culture as well, right? Because I know, because I sit in my office alone and create these products, and there's only so much that one person can do, and there's only so much that a small group of people can do, or in this case, a tribal culture can do. And so my fear is actually that these stories will be lost because we can't get them recorded fast enough. We can get them written down and published and put out there and marketed. It's not just about publishing it, it's about marketing it. And we can't do that fast enough. And my fear is that these stories will be lost because of that. And again, that is not my decision to make either, I don't think. Although I have had storytellers tell me, hey, if you do your research and you want to write it, you should do that. And I've made the decision, at least in this moment, not to do that. And is that a right decision or a wrong decision? I have no idea. I do think that in this whole conversation, I think is maybe important to note that I'm not sure I have the answers, right? I'm just one person trying to sort of make my way, trying to at least let people know that there is a way to teach kids about the world's religions. This is one way to do it. I'm not sure it's the right way, quote unquote, right way. I'm not sure it's the best way. It's a way, and hopefully I am part of the conversation of how we should do this, how best to do this. Probably at this point we just need to do it more, right? There's just so little out there. And so a lot of people in both in the interfaith world and in the religious literacy world like to argue about these sorts of details, and I get that, and it's important for us to be reflective and to think about it, but there's so much to be done and there's so little out there that at this point I'm kind of like, hey, let's all put stuff out there. I mean, this is what we did with climate change, right? I mean, as I often tell people, Rachel Carson's book was written when? In 1962, Silent Spring? And it's taken us, 60 years to get to a point where this is a regular everyday discussion, right? And we're nowhere near that when it comes to interfaith work or religious literacy work. So, I'm just one person trying to put some stuff out there, and I don't want to overstate my certainty in my approach or my ideas about it.
Well said, right? That we're at the beginning of this, right? That sometimes the materials that are out there are not great, but sometimes there is just a huge lacuna, right? There's a huge gap in what's available. So, you get the $100 million grant from the Gates Foundation, right, to fix this problem, right? You have the opportunity to work, to write the books, to hire the staff, to develop new curricula, to develop new projects. What do you think the next 50 years look like? What are the things that need to be done? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think again, if we look at some other topics, right, like the discussion about race in America, and the discussion about climate change, what we see is that the way you make real change is to have lots of people who are interested in the movement, right? And so for me, I don't know what I'd do with $100 million, but if I had $10 million, right, I would start writing books, and I would give those books away, right? So that every school had, not only did they have my book, We All Have Sacred Spaces, right? But they had other things like We All Love Lights, right? We all celebrate holy days. We all eat special foods, right? There's a whole series that could be done with that, right? The same thing with my Embracing Peace, Stories from the World's Religions, right? One of the things that I like to look at are themes. If you look really, really closely at these, quote unquote, top 6 religious traditions, or within a religious tradition, right? Everything gets so specific and everything is different from everything else, and it's just detail after detail. But if you step back just a little bit and look at some of the overarching themes, what religion is often trying to do for a culture or for a people is to help them, not kill each other, right? Live in peace, right? Live with compassion, take care of the people and the animals and the beings and the plants around them. And so if we back up just a little bit, so Embracing Peace, where I took peace-related stories from across the world's religions, well, you could do that with compassion. One of the units that I did at the church was Embracing the Darkness, right? Religions are often trying to help people deal with those human emotions that we often call negative, like greed or pride, right? So there's like 5 or 6 books that could be written about that. And then there's also sort of fiction books that might be written. So I would just, hire staff and write all these books that really look at a variety of religious traditions in a single volume from a relatively objective standpoint, right? So that kids can sort of get this reasonably objective overview, right? And I would give them all away. I would just put them in schools. I would give them to teachers, and I would spend all my time, presenting to teachers, to grandparents, to parents, and saying, look, this is one way to do this. We can do it. Kids are capable of this, and get the conversation going. And what we saw with climate change is you had schools getting on board, right? You had nonprofit organizations developing lesson plans and putting those out there, free resources. Then you had churches, right? Faith communities for climate change, right? So there's green Islam, there's green Judaism, there's green Christianity, right? And so that's what ultimately, having a number of different organizations, right? Having government organizations, having nonprofit organizations, and in some respects having, if we could ever get religious organizations who were actually interested in doing this, which I think is not going to happen in my lifetime. But yeah, I'm all about just giving the information away, right? And encouraging and inspiring people. That's what I would do with the money.
So we're about out of time, but where I think, and maybe I'm opening a can of worms here, but you talk about getting people involved with the movement, right? And I would dare to say, from my experience, I don't see that there's a religious literacy movement yet.
Yeah.
If we have any movement at all, there's an interfaith movement that people sometimes trace back to, like the World Parliament of Religions in the 1893, and that is really inspired kind of a particular way of thinking about religious diversity. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between that interfaith movement that most people, I think, might have at least heard of, and why that is different or distinct from, the values or the things that you're talking about when you're talking about religious literacy?
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm right about this either, but I spent many years in the interfaith movement. That's really where I started out when my company was called Faith Seeker Kids. And I was hoping to market to progressive type Christian churches. So I did spend a fair bit of time in the interfaith movement. And there were a lot of that work. Yeah, you can talk about the Parliament of World Religions in the late 1800s, but really a lot of that work started after 9/11, right? Mm-hmm. And many interfaith organizations that I interviewed, I wrote about 40 articles for an online publication at the time called the Interfaith Observer. And a lot of people that I talked to when I interviewed them for that article, those articles, they had started after 9/11, right? So one of the things that I see has happened in the interfaith movement is that it tends to actually not talk about people's faith very much and not talk about people's religion very much. It tends to center on, I think, social justice causes and transcending your faith and your religion, right? To find some sort of common element. And I think Ibu Patel of Interfaith America, formerly of Interfaith Youth Corps, has specifically said this, right? Is that what you really need to do is you need to move past religion, transcend religion, and realize that we have these common causes that we're working on, like climate change or racial justice or gender equality. And so that, again, that's all good and that's fine. And I think there's a place for that. I agree with you that the religious literacy sphere is not a movement. It's not a movement at all, right? It's a bunch of kind of well-meaning do-gooder individuals who are kind of putting their stuff out there. But I just, I do it because I believe there's a place for that approach in our culture. And I think that's becoming even more clear with these conversations around intersectionalities, right? So this idea that religion is part of your identity, right, is important. And as we continue to talk about what makes us who we are, religious identity is important. I kind of didn't finish my thought before, but there's been some research. We know people don't go to church every Sunday. We see various houses of worship shutting down. But when you ask people, about their religious identity, even if they never go to church, they haven't been to church since they were 15 years old, they will tell you, oh, my identity is Christian. That's the religious language I speak. Those are the rituals that make sense to me, right? Or or I'm Jewish, right? And we talk about being ethnically Jewish, and like that's a thing, and it is a thing, but you can also be ethnically Christian or ethnically Hindu or any of those things. So I think that just sort of trying to transcend our religious identity is not the full answer. We're not going to get where we need to be as a culture or as a species by just doing that. I think we have to acknowledge the importance of religion on literature, on culture, and on our own individual identities, and on the diversity we see within America, because that is not going away anytime soon.
All right. Well, I think that seems like a great place to stop the conversation. It's a really nice bow on the whole thing. So, Vicki Garlock, thank you very much for appearing on ReligionWise. This has been really great.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
This has been ReligionWise, a podcast produced by the Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding of Muhlenberg College. ReligionWise is produced and directed by Christine Flicker. For more information about additional programming, or to make an inquiry about a speaking engagement, please visit our website at religionandculture.com. There, you'll find our contact information, links to other programming, and have the opportunity to support the work of the Institute. Please subscribe to ReligionWise wherever you get your podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time.